This conference will now be recorded.
Great. So with this, I want to welcome everybody to Washington Farm Forestry Association's very first virtual town hall, actually our very first town hall. That don't know me, I'm Elaine Oneil. I'm the Executive Director of Washington Farm Forestry Association. Today, we're really delighted to have as our guest the candidate for Commissioner of Public Lands, Sue Kuehl Pederson. Sue has quite a long history in natural resources, but I believe this is your first run at an elected position. Is that correct, Sue?
Well, no, actually, I ran for state senate 4 years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, then she's in much more
But
of
I
a first.
am
Yeah.
I am new to politics. I still feel that way.
Okay. So before we get going, I wanted to go through a few little housekeeping details for the people on the line. I know some of you are calling in from remote areas and you don't have the best bandwidth. That's one of the reasons why we've basically eliminated the web option in this talk, except for Sue and myself. We have, and that should improve your chances of adequate bandwidth. If you're starting to experience a lot of dropping, then one of the things that you can do is keep this on, or perhaps even just use the call-in number and listen to it over your phone. If you do that, please do *6 so we don't hear any background, the door slamming, the dog barking, etc. And that allows us to continue on with this discussion. The way that we've structured this, we did invite questions. I think I had almost 50 questions. We don't have time to go through 50 questions, but a lot of them were very similar. So they've been collated into a synthesis of 10 different topics. So we're going to give Sue a little bit of time to talk about herself. And we're going to have, every once in a while, we'll have an interruption probably from John Matson giving us a heads up on the time so that we don't run over. And I think we're going to cover a lot of we have a lot of territory to cover. Was a lot of really good questions, some nice generic ones and some pretty specific ones. Everything from fire and forest health to regulation, some stuff around incentives, conversion, legislative priorities, partnerships, community engagement, you name it, it came in there. But I think we have basically 5 big bins we're going to look at. General vision, some fire and forest health, some regulation, lots of good questions around conversion, and some legislative priorities. So with that, I'm going to cede the mic to Sue, and you can probably give us anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes of your introduction and why you decided to run for this position and what you bring to the table.
Okay, thank you so much, Elaine. I have met just a few of you. I wish I could see you now, but we'll get by with your initials. So Sue Kuehl Pederson is my name, and I grew up at a salmon hatchery on the Columbia River, surrounded by timber. We had a thriving timber industry in Skamania County, and our schools, as our state constitution directs, our schools had lots of revenues from timber sales. So we had very well-funded schools. I attribute that to my later successes in life. I had such a good foundation in my education based on timber. I totally appreciate that. And I regret that it's not the same now. The same little school I went to, I had 8 kids in my class, and that little school is just struggling now. The parents have to pay, even though it's a public school, the parents have to pay a little additional to run the school. So later I got a bachelor's degree at Western Washington University, and I became a fish biologist myself. I had so many wonderful opportunities. One of my first experiences professionally was that I joined the Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA Fisheries, and I helped with research on the Columbia and Snake River dams. We used radio telemetry to follow adult salmon going upstream over the dams. Later, I worked for a private company that used sonar to study the juveniles going downstream. So I got a really good picture of what's happening at our dams. I went on to become a habitat manager for the State Fish and Wildlife Department, although it was called Fisheries back then, and was put in charge. This is where I have a pretty strong interface with you folks. I was the habitat manager for Kitsap and parts of Mason and King counties. And in that position, I approved hydraulic project approval permits, HPAs. I also reviewed forest practices applications and did SEPA, State Environmental Policy Act reviews. And I'm sure there were other permits involved, but I was mostly a permit and regulatory agent. I hope you don't hold that against me. So after that, I also was a fisheries harvest manager. I was the commercial, non-tribal fisheries harvest manager for Puget Sound, gillnet and purse seine fisheries. Let's see. Then I was employed by King County DNR. I ran a project called Jobs for the Environment, where I was in charge of a lot of habitat restoration in King County, which involved, forestry and streams and working with displaced timber workers, because by then they had been losing their jobs, which makes me very sad. How am I doing on time?
You have about 2 more minutes. Perfect.
So I started working for Seattle City Light in their environmental division. After all the permitting experience I'd had, they hired me to be the liaison for about 12 agencies involved in the permitting for a new hydropower plant. So I managed that project for a couple of years and really enjoyed trying to make everything work so that the city could build their plant. But I got interested in the power side of Seattle City Light. I worked with a lot of those people, and they brought me over to the power management division, and I was able to learn all about our hydropower and other generators, how they are all integrated to deliver power to their customers. It's fascinating and very complex. I manage very large contracts for the city of Seattle and interacted with Bonneville Power Administration and the Corps of Engineers. And then I went back to school, got a master's degree in public administration, and retired as the power manager of Grays Harbor PUD. So that's my professional background. I can tell you that my vision, when I get elected, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, but it's not COVID. I got tested. So my vision as Commissioner of Public Lands, generally speaking, as a Republican, I prefer limited government. I believe that the regulatory function among our environmental agencies has really gone too far. And I believe in landowners to take good care of their property and to follow the laws. I'm very much willing to make life a lot easier for landowners and businesses. That's my big goal. But my primary, urgent, high priority is to do everything I can, and I've just been racking my brain to figure out ideas for how to stop or at least greatly curtail these catastrophic wildfires that we've been having. I cannot, that's the main reason I decided to run for this office. I feel I have the skills and the background that could really take care of these problems and just stop these catastrophic fires. Is that about 5 minutes?
Well, that's a little bit more than 5 minutes, but that's okay because that's pulling us into some of the questions that that were coming up in that general vision, sort of policies and priorities. So you touched a little bit on them. This idea of what is sound forest policy in the state writ large. So now we know that DNR deals with a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And they have all sorts of leases for all sorts of things, but we're dealing right now with small forest landowners. So we want to know sort of your big vision for the forestry side of DNR, and then the some conversation about what's lacking at present, and where do you see small forest landowners in that whole big picture. So that's 3 different questions. I've nested them here so you can deal with them in any order you want. But I'll give you about 5 minutes.
Okay. It's great to have 5 minutes. Usually I only get 2. So the small forest landowners, I'm getting the impression, and the Millers and Mr. Oh, I'm drawing a blank. The kind gentleman who was with us at Miller's, Rich. His name is Rich.
Yeah, Rich Weiss.
Rich Weiss. Thank you. Sorry, Rich, I forgot your last name. The tour that I was given, it was probably in July, at the Miller farm, was very enlightening to me. And, I was an environmental regulator back in the 90s, and then I branched over into public power issues. So it had been a long time since I had visited some property and seen the kinds of concerns the regulators are having on the Miller's tree farm. Well, I was stunned. I was very stunned. It seemed to me the pendulum had swung really far from what we were concerned about when I was doing that work and what the Millers were showing me. I think that it's time to just trust in people, landowners, farm foresters. We need to give the land back to the landowners. It almost feels like takings to me in some ways, that you have so many rules to abide by. I'm not saying we should drop all the rules, but the process for getting permission, approval, just seems incredibly wieldy. So I have been thinking a lot about this, and I think that I would be trying to put information online. I'm hearing though that some of you have broadband issues, but it should be easy enough to share with landowners what the rules are, what you need to watch for, how to deal with different situations, and then trust them to be doing the right thing. I really think that landowners are the best stewards of our land. And on that note, my feeling is that the Department of Natural Resources seems to have mission creep in many ways. They are always taking on more and more and more work, hiring more and more people. I think their staff is 2,000 employees. And they're taking on work for the federal government, which I don't understand. They get paid for it, but still, that means more employees, more government agency for the state. And so my feeling is we need to better define what exactly is the DNR supposed to be doing. I feel like the tentacles have been reaching out farther and farther. So my goal would be to streamline permit applications and processing. I don't really think that every application needs to have 2 or 3 people come out to inspect. I think that's a waste of time and money. We could just look at pictures maybe. So I feel like the agency has just burgeoned into something that maybe it wasn't really meant to be. I know that DNR takes on a huge responsibility for firefighting, and I want to evaluate how that works because it seems to be based on a 1957 agreement, and that's a long time ago. Things have changed. We have forests that have been neglected and are more prone to fires with extra fuel now. We need to really examine responsibilities and roles of different agencies, different landowners. I totally agree that you can't put boundaries on forest fires. They tend to cross boundaries. But I just want to examine what are we doing and why are we doing it this way? Because so far I haven't been able to understand why it's organized the way it is. And I'm hearing from people, well, I visited these horrible fires over in Okanagan this summer, and I hear from citizens the kinds of things that didn't go right. I mean, there was a fire that had been smoldering for 2 days and given a low priority, so nobody put it out. They were waiting for permission from the federal incident command folks. The permission didn't come, so nobody put this fire out. Then they tried to open the gate to put it out, but nobody had the key, so they waited another day for the key to arrive. And I thought, oh, why don't you just tear out the gate and put the fire out? So I'm hearing stories like this that just make me think, I think we need to do a lot of evaluation of how things are working now and how we could make improvements.
And so we need to move on. We've touched on a lot of different elements here. And with that many elements, I think there's a real critical question here. I'm going to give you 2 minutes on this, maybe
Okay.
even less. What are your top 5 priorities that you think DNR should focus on in the next 4 years? Your top 5 priorities. You get 5.
Well,
You don't even have to pick
5.
2.
I'll try to do 5, but I'll tell you 1, 2, and 3 are reducing or eliminating these catastrophic fires. This is an emergency situation, and it's something that I don't see much urgency about solving the problem of catastrophic fires. So, I am thinking of things like, well, heck, why don't we just plow some fire breaks around farms and towns like the pioneers did? How easy and cheap and quick is that? And I also feel that our large forested areas have been, because we don't log anymore, they take out logging roads, so you don't have a break. You don't even have access really to get in on roads. And clear cuts are, a thing of the past. So when a fire catches, it just goes and goes. It's so hot from all the fuel. And then there's no break, so it just charges through hundreds of thousands of acres and kills people and livestock and wildlife. So,
So
so
we
my
have
idea,
1:40 and you have 1 minute left.
okay, so my idea is to put fire breaks around segments of forest. Break up this big blanket of trees into segments so that if one segment catches fire, at least slow down when it gets to a fire break around the segment. Okay, so and then I've talked about the regulatory function. I think that is onerous for landowners, and I want to change that. And then the forest health um, principles that are starting to kick in. I am very much in favor of thinning our forests, reducing the amount of fuel in our forests, whether it's big trees that got too large and crowded and diseased, or the undergrowth that is catching on fire and spreading. How many is that? 4?
We're actually gonna segue into fire and forest health because that's your main focus here.
Okay.
And um, we're going to take a couple of moments here to talk. There's some very specific questions in here that came from some of our Eastern Washington landowners, things that they're dealing with in this wildfire and forest health realm. But first, there was just a very general question, and this often arises when people from the west side are over in the Eastern Washington. The Eastern Washington folks say, what do you know about forest ecology relative to fire? You know, you're a fisheries biologist, but you have this other natural resource background. What do you understand about Eastside forest ecology relative to fire?
Well, I'm aware that the predominantly ponderosa pine forests on the east side benefit from fires because the cones release the seeds when they are burned, and also the east side tends to have a lot of the pine needles that become fire tinder in those forests. I know that the trees grow more slowly, and uh, when they burn hot, and they're hard to put out. Um, I don't know if there's more that you want me to add to that. I'm always open to learn more if I don't know it already.
Right. Let's just move on because I think some of this it'll become part of the conversation here. So
Mhm.
there was a question about the fact that, and it's probably even worse with COVID, people are, leaving the cities and moving into rural areas. And a lot of them are moving into rural east side areas. So they're either in the rural or ultra rural, and they don't really know about fire and fire risk. They
Mhm.
go into this place and it's beautiful and it's got lots of trees and they think, oh, this is this great, thinking it's like the west side, which is a lot wetter and it's very, very dry. So what's your plan to, in terms of, raising the money and implementing to quickly increase the Firewise preparedness in community? Firewise is a program. And to educate and convey the need for compliance with these new landowners in these areas, because we are, currently in this wildfire crisis. What's your plan for funding and implementation of increased Firewise preparedness in these communities? 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I have actually asked Hillary Franz if she has actually started that, because she talks a lot about educating people how to make their homes or lands more fire wise. But I'm not aware that she's done anything, and I've been racking my brain. Oh my gosh, how can you inform a lot of people quickly how to be more responsible and safer in the conditions we're in? And I'm thinking of things like the ad council. I think you get free ads from the ad council if they approve your request. Putting inserts in property tax statements, putting inserts in utility bills. Um, I know that Ms. Franz talks about using social media, but I don't think she has yet. She has a flyer and some links on the DNR website. But my feeling is, how would a new resident know to look? How do they even know that DNR exists? And then how do they know to look on the DNR website? So I would just figure out the best ways to reach a lot of people, have community meetings where you inform people, put flyers in their mailbox, anything, anything to help people understand the risks, because they're great.
Okay, and you alluded to this in one of your earlier, identifying your priorities. You talk about the fact that we have mission creep, we have in terms of doing more and more, and we have this issue with fighting wildfires, and the issues with access and whose right is it to fight the fire on federal land and state land and private land. So there's actually, as you say, millions of acres out there that's basically severely overstocked. It's just ready for that fire. Oh, did we lose you? I might have lost her.
Oh, she's still there.
You're back.
Yeah. She's good.
Okay. So how do you plan to work with these other resource organizations? Because obviously DNR has responsibility for state lands and they have responsibility for private lands, but not federal lands. How do you plan to work with these other organizations to deal with this forest management threat? And we'll give you 2 minutes on that.
Well, a lot of the people I met with over in the Okanagan talked to me about their preference would be to make it okay for local residents to spray a hose on a little fire so that it doesn't get bigger. So the timeliness is huge in this fire situation, any fire situation. Timeliness is enormous. So I would try to figure out a way to allow local residents and landowners to take action, because putting out a little fire is not nearly as hard as putting out a huge fire, obviously. Another thing is, I'm hoping to revive the logging industry, and that will be needed in order to start working on forest health. We'll have to thin out trees, and then we need fire breaks. That's a natural thing in a untouched forest, is to have open areas where fires don't spread as quickly. So I'm hoping that having more people working in the woods, which is how it was when I was a kid, the loggers put out fires. If they saw a little flame start, they put it out because they would be there and they would be close by and they could act quickly. That's one thing. I also think that it sounds like the layers of authority need to be clarified a little better, and there needs to be a bigger emphasis on quick action as opposed to proper permission. I know the permission is important, but I think to be just practical, common sense means any fire you see, you put it out quickly. And I don't get the sense that that is happening. Another thing I find odd is that in some DNR financial statements, I noticed a little footnote that said the State Office of Financial Management would authorize payments to DNR for firefighting, but only if they put out 95% of the number of fires in a fiscal year. And I thought, well, what does that mean? That the other 5% have a low priority? Because I think every fire needs to have high priority, 100%. So little things like that, my mind is working on that and trying to figure out how does this get better.
Okay. Do you, speaking of this in terms of doing these kinds of treatments to reduce fire risk, to do the thinning, et cetera, and this is a fairly technical question that came in from one of our Eastside practitioners. I'm not going to read the whole thing and take me 2 minutes, but in essence, if you're doing a thinning and there's no recovery, no economic value to be recovered, you don't need a forest practices permit. There's other kinds of permitting that you use. But you don't need a forest practices permit. And there's nothing in the RCW or nothing in the rules and laws that say that you need to have a forest practices permit for stuff that's non-commercial. But you do need it for commercial, which makes sense. There's a lot of things tied with that. But there seems to be this policy developed within the forest practices division that anything over 8 inches is deemed commercial and therefore you need a permit.
Oh, really? Huh.
Well, over there, that's what you need a permit. But the bottom line is that 8-inch trees are not commercial over there.
Right.
And what they're finding is that essentially, in order to make a go of this stuff, and in order to remove all of the material that needs to be removed, that's non-commercial, they're not willing to do a forest practices permit, so they end up removing material that's up to 8 inches and leaving the stuff over 8 inches, and you still have a fire problem. In other words, you haven't dealt with the whole problem. So
Mm-hmm.
the question was, and they're not getting any traction on this, is
Mm-hmm.
this one of the regulatory situations where you would support directing the Forest Practices Division to change that trigger in Eastern Washington from 8 inches to 12 inches diameter?
Absolutely. I mean, again, my goal is to reduce the fuels that are feeding these catastrophic fires. We have to stop having catastrophic fires. Controlled burns, fine. Even, a little accidental burn, fine. But we have to do everything we can. We have dead babies. We have dead firefighters. We have ranches that are nothing but rubble, just rubble. It's extreme. It's so extreme, and I just can't stand by and say, "Oh, this is the new normal." This is not the new normal to me. So I would do everything I can to make healthier forests that don't burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and spread like crazy. That's my. But again, to your question, I'm aware of other uses for these smaller pieces of wood, whether it's CLT.
No markets. There are no markets over there because
I
there are
know.
no mills in the
I
entire
realize. I
um,
realized that. So another suggestion that I got from a citizen was graze. I was told that grazing can happen in the forests and clean up a lot of the underbrush that way. Grazing, either cattle or goats or sheep. That's one idea that's been uh, presented to me.
okay.
That another person thought it would be um, interesting to provide jobs to welfare recipients who need some kind of activity and um, a way to start working and getting out into the labor force and teaching them skills and helping them feel, good about their labor. Um, Yeah, I'm open. I am in a brainstorming mode, and so I'm very open to suggestions, and I'm a problem solver, and what I've been seeing is the problems are not getting solved. So that is my biggest passion for this position.
So one of the other things, and this is going to tie in one of the comments you made about prescribed burns and actually some legislative stuff. So we've been working for a number of years around this idea of how do you change liability laws around prescribed burns?
Hmm.
Because most entities, whether they're large or small, are pretty averse to using it because of
Mhm.
liability laws and because of the smoke laws. How
Yeah.
do you see tackling that particular part of the problem?
Well,
Because
for
I
one thing,
agree with
for
you,
one,
we prescribe burns, but we've got a liability problem
yeah,
that it basically requires a legislative fix, and then we have an air quality problem, which probably also requires a policy fix in a organization agency that is not your own.
right. Ecology, probably.
Mhm.
Um, so, s- huh. Um, I think prescribed burns make sense. Because they're, historically they were used for centuries around here. I don't think that prescribed burns make any sense at all if you just finished having catastrophic fires that billowed smoke, you know, for weeks. thick smoke for weeks. I don't want to add to that impact with the controlled burn smoke. So I'm a little hesitant to use controlled burns on the heels of these horrible fires. But one thing is you really have to control the timing of them. I just read in the paper that somebody is doing a controlled burn on the Olympic Peninsula this week, and I thought, this is awfully close to the time of year when everything is dry. I think you need to be really practical about doing controlled burns when there's more moisture. And I agree with what you say about regulations would need to be changed. My preference is to use mechanical means because, I mean, even then you might get a spark, but every fire can burn out of control. So it just feels risky to me.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on to regulation, and we're now 6 minutes behind, but I'm an expert.
Oh, okay.
What we talked a lot when we were at Ken's, and there were a lot of questions around this idea of in the Forest and Fish Law, which was implemented it was part of the Forest and Fish Agreement in 1999. The law came into effect shortly thereafter, and we were promised a bunch of things coming out of that deal because
I remember you telling me about that.
What action, and I guess there are several actions in there. One was around funding for some mitigation programs. And so one of them is what specifically can or will you do to ensure the promises of forest fish, including the FREP funding and smaller buffers for smaller harvests, are fulfilled in the upcoming year?
In the upcoming year, I'm not sure I could move that fast, but what comes to mind is, I'm sorry, what?
We can always hope.
I would hope too. I would hope for that. The thing is, right now, I think that the DNR is spending way too much money on way too many people. They have 72 year-round firefighters. I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting because to have a fire, you need heat and oxygen and fuel. The heat is not there in the summer. That's why things don't burn in the winter. So I think they could use a little bit of trimming and more focus on what their actual jurisdictional tasks are supposed to be. I really do believe that the DNR is taking on too much, and they're not. If we can get a handle on the catastrophic fires, all the costs should go way down because they spend a lot of money on firefighting, and so I would hope that enough money would be freed up that they could fulfill their contracts with folks like you and move forward.
What in our conversations and the work you've done in preparing for this office, can you give me an understanding of what you understand, of the situation that we're facing, trying to realize the promises made in this deal 20 years ago, this Forest and Fish Agreement?
Well, when you told me the background, I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to get a handle on where you are so we can ask the appropriate questions here.
Okay. When you gave me the background of the way the smaller tree farmers have been treated, I was stunned, really. I mean, you're an integral part of our natural resources family in Washington, and you gave up land for buffers and other regulations, and you did that on the good faith that you would get something back. And I'm shocked that you don't have, the payments back that you were agreeing to. It seems like, well, here's another thing. I hope we get a different attorney general in the attorney general's office, because I think that the executive committee in Olympia seems very unaware or uncaring about citizens' rights. I see citizens' rights being trampled on in about every which way you can imagine. I mean, that from all the shutdowns of businesses for COVID and, you know, seemingly arbitrary decisions about who gets to do what they want to do and who doesn't. So, so I think we need some new leadership in many of the layers of Olympia executive offices. But I am a person who carefully follows contract. I mean, I was a contract manager for power companies. I was managing hundreds of millions of dollars to the penny because I am very uh, concerned about the details.
So one of the challenges with this is that the funding for these mitigation programs, like Forest Riparian Easement Program, we call it FREP, triple F double P, which is easier than saying the Family Fish Forest Passage Program. That's 3 times fast. It comes through the DNR's budget request, but it's funded by the legislature. So the question is, describe your strategy for effectively working with the legislature to achieve this promise of this funding for FREP and triple F double P. How would you work with the legislature? How would you direct your staff to work with the legislature to bring this across the finish line? Because it's usually in the budget, it just never happens.
Oh, well, I can personally go and talk to legislators. I want to bring up another sort of unrelated issue, but it ties in. The legislature in January of this year, Senator John Brown from Chehalis actually drew up a bill. I think it was 6195 that would have funded the DNR for 20 years, $500 million in order for Hillary to do this forest health treatment plan. And it never got out of committee, even though in 2017, the bill 5546, which required Hillary to come up with these 10-year and 20-year forest health plans, that bill that required the plans was unanimously passed all the way through the House and Senate, and Inslee signed it. So a few years later, nobody wants to fund it. $20 million was up for bond issuance, and Hillary didn't even try to get it out of committee. I will be super motivated to get that kind of if somebody made me an offer for $500 million in bond issuance to do my program, I'd be all over it. I would be meeting with every single legislator and talking them into it. So, I think it kind of boils down to what's right. You do what's right. And what's right to me is you keep your promises, you satisfy contractual obligations for sure, and that's where my focus would be. I'm not kidding you. This is something I really would be focused on. I just think it sounds incredibly unfair. And you guys already have had some pretty unfair treatment with the regulatory requirements you've been trying to meet.
Right. So one of the things we have been working on is alternate harvest restrictions for smaller harvests on smaller streams. And I'm going to share my screen. I want to show you some pictures, and then I have a question.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Not yet. Oh, now I can. Yes.
See those
Mhm.
two beautiful pictures? Uh,
Yes.
These are courtesy of Ken Miller. The one
Mhm.
on the bottom right is a property that he is reforesting. He's converting it from an old part of a golf course into forest land. And you
Nice.
see that little ribbon running through it? That is called a fish-bearing stream. It's dry all summer.
Um,
And then over on the top left, he was recently over in Eastern Washington, and he had a picture. He's touring with some friends, and this is apparently another fish stream. You can sort of see it there. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not.
oh, oh,
Probably not.
that's a stream.
Those are fish streams. And so you're a fisheries biologist. And
Yes.
our common sense question is, why do these small seasonal fish streams, they're less than 5 feet wide, need these giant buffers? I mean, in some cases, if it's a really high site, not so much in the Eastern Washington, it's different numbers, but a very high site, that could require a 150-foot buffer on it.
What? 150 feet?
The question is,
Are you
why
serious?
why
What?
do they require such a big buffer? Maybe it's only 101 feet if you do whack and pack. 101 feet
Okay.
on both sides just to
Well,
buffer the thing that goes dry in the summer.
yeah.
So we were promised alternate harvest restrictions. And my question to you as a fisheries biologist is, one, why do they require it? And two, what are you going to do as DNR to support us in moving forward in alternate harvest restrictions?
Well, I spoke earlier of my time as a habitat biologist and how the pendulum has swung much, much farther than I ever would have dreamed. So, water typing, when you decide whether they've changed the codes on me, but it used to be type 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's letters, so I'm not familiar with the letters. But an intermittent stream is probably not a fish bearing stream. I don't know, somebody might think that this is going to improve water quality farther downstream where the fish actually occur. But to me, this this is something that's been really kind of frustrating me lately is a lot of the environmental regulations or um, intent is to keep everything the same. I keep getting this feeling that a lot of our laws, they want nature never stays the same. Nature always changes. There will be a landslide, or there will be, trees falling down in the wind or whatever. Things are always changing in nature, and I feel like the environmental advocates are now of the opinion that everything should always stay the same. I don't share that opinion. I think we all need to be a little more relaxed about, how for one thing, when I look at these pictures, this is not public land. This is private land. The owner of this land should be able to do whatever they want as long as they're not, totally wrecking a huge area of land. Mother Nature heals our mistakes very generously. But in terms of what I would do about this situation, I would argue the point that this little tiny tract of grass is not a salmon stream. It's beyond ridiculous to me to call that to call that a stream that needs over 100-foot buffers on it. Man, when I was a biologist working as a habitat biologist, we were lucky to get 25-foot buffers, and we thought that was great. And that's on a wide stream. So things have really gone pretay far in the other direction, I think. I would
And
definitely be an
they,
advocate for the
that's
landowner here.
That's really good to hear. Although I do believe we have one of our guys on who's the National Tree Farmer of the Year. He actually has salmon fishing, swimming across his field. So he resurrected his stream, which was an improvement. But then the
Huh.
question, what happens after that? So there's all these nuances. I'm very happy to hear that you would be willing to work with it in terms of providing landowners a little bit more grace in how they see to move forward. Now, oftentimes decisions like this of what do you do with the stream happen with what's called an alternate plan. You get this advisory group that comes out, and they have representatives from DNR and the other agencies and the tribes. They show up on these ID teams. They're called to look at these things and make some decisions. But the ultimate decision resides with the field forester. How can we help encourage those field foresters to make those decisions based on, the vision that you're laying out as opposed to the vision of the entire group? Is that something that you see as a role as the leader of a large agency in terms of encouraging more of this decision making down with your forestry professionals in the field?
Well, I'm really struggling because I know there are laws that determine a lot of this activity. My personal feeling after my lifetime of looking at land and natural resources and being involved in permitting my heart of heart is saying, why is this even happening? This land belongs to these people who are private landowners, and why does the government have anything to do with what you're doing on your land? That's my philosophy as a Republican. I'm all for limited government, and this is like government on steroids here, where you have to wait for some official to come to your land and tell you what you can or cannot do for a little ditch that dries up all summer. I just don't understand. It's like things have just gone way out of whack in terms of property rights. The thing is, I grew up in the 70s when people were still catching rivers on fire. In Cleveland, a river caught on fire because of pollution. The Love Canal was a total toxic waste dump that they built a housing development on top of it. I mean, bad things happened in the 70s and before then. But you know what? A lot of time has gone by. A lot of people have learned about environmental stewardship, and we're, especially landowners, my observation is that most landowners really want to take good care of their lands. And they're not trying to, damage natural resources. They're just trying to enjoy their land. I see that as a property right.
We need to move on here. We're running way behind. We hardly have touched conversion. So I want to talk a little bit about land conversion. We're honing in on a new report from the University of Washington that's going to talk about what changes have happened in the last 13 years in small forest landowners. But what we do know is that there has been a lot of conversion from forest land, the 20s, the 40s, down to 5s, and some of them even into different kinds of development. We know our development rights are far more valuable than timberland.
Sure.
And what policies do you plan to implement to ensure more forest land stays forested for generations to come? What kind of policies would you look at advocating for or implementing within the structures that you can advocate for? Like, you don't control growth management, but you control other things.
I wish. I think the Growth Management Act could use some reevaluation. So again, I think that most, this is just my assumption, that most smaller forest landowners would appreciate less regulation. And I would hope that that could also help you be a little more profitable with your timber harvests or whatever you're trying to grow. That's one thing. As far as converting to residential, I I understand the need for your lands to remain forested, but I think if you choose to sell your land and somebody converts it to residential, I don't see that the government should be the ones who decide. I think, I realize the Growth Management Act has all kinds of planning requirements. I know how this works. It's just that I disagree with it. So, you know, I'm a good manager. I can follow the rules and I can do what my job would require me to do. But I would definitely be vocal about saying why are we doing this? Why don't we let the landowners actually own and manage their own lands however they want to?
What about transfer of development rights?
Transfer of development rights? I
Right.
guess I guess I'm not familiar with what that means.
That's where you, instead of selling the property or developing the property, you actually get paid as if you were developing the property. So the conversion
Oh,
value could be 10 times
oh,
higher than the timber value. You're getting paid
oh.
that conversion value or some portion of it, but you
Hmm.
get to keep it in timber, and then it carries a covenant with it.
And do
In
you
other words,
still get to?
the land
You,
would no longer be developable, but you would get the money that you would have got if it had been developable.
and then do you have other requirements like you can't cut your trees or you have to manage it a certain way?
Well, that's the rub of some of these things that hasn't been ironed out.
Oh, okay.
It's
Well, I'm
most
familiar with,
practice.
a lot. I'm familiar with the agreement that a lot of landowners have to set aside some of their property as I forget the term, but they're like habitat easements, or people agree not to disturb their land because they're next to a stream or something, and they get a tax break for doing that. I'm familiar with that program. But again, I really think the landowner needs to be in charge. I would not be against payments for not converting land, because you have to think of the value, the ecological value of having the forest is important. That's a value, a different value than cutting trees and selling them. This is something that I've been reading about. There's some national forests in Arizona where they've for 10 or more years they've been doing forest health treatments, and faced with the problem what you talked about earlier, where the wood that had to be removed to make the forest healthier was not sellable. So they figured out other ways to value the forest health itself. The quality of not having fires, or the externality, the extra benefit that is there. They're struggling with how to put value on that and
Okay.
then move the value to the landowners.
Well, we're zeroing in here. We have about one more minute, and we
Oh,
have one more, well, we have a lot more questions, but I think we've covered a lot of territory here. And I just want to ask one last question about um, we anticipate there's probably going to be some pretty massive budget cuts due to the effect of COVID on the economy. What portions of the DNR budget could be trimmed, and what portions are essential based on your priorities for uh, should you become Commissioner of Public Lands?
well, the first budget I would cut, I found out that I did a lot of poking around in the DNR website. I found out that when Hillary Franz took office in 2017, she immediately increased her admin budget from 832,000 up to 1.9 million, and it stayed at 1.9 million the rest of the time. So first thing I do is cut that admin budget. And as I've been saying, I want to push a lot of the DNR work out to the private sector. So I really think the jobs belong in the private sector, not at DNR. So maybe those DNR employees would need to work for the private sector. I'm not sure how it all shakes out, because I've also asked for a lot of records that just never got answered. The public records requests, the stuff they sent me had nothing to do with my questions in most cases. So I still have a lot to learn about how their budgets work, but I have poked through as much as I can, and I really am good at, hey, if you don't think I'm good at managing on a shoestring, Hillary Fans has over $900,000 in her campaign fund. I've raised about 40,000, and I'm still here. I'm still kicking, and I still hope to win. But that I'm good. I'm good at being frugal. That's one thing I'm really good at. I've had to be at some points in my life, and I'm 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 capable and willing to just make cuts. I mean, the government is there for the people, and I really get frustrated when government thinks that they're, you know, the end goal. They're not. They're just supposed to facilitate what the people need, and we just go way too far towards building little empires in our government. That's not me.
Well, that's really wonderful to hear, and we have gone 2 minutes over. So I want to be
I'm sorry.
sensitive. No, I think that was a great way to end. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I want to thank you so much
Oh,
for
thank
giving
you.
us this time
Thank
and
you
giving us
all. My
the opportunity
pleasure.
to, to learn a little bit more about you, more in depth, more than those 3-minute videos they give you.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time with us tonight, and thanks to everybody who came in and participated as an audience member, and we will make this available. I'll probably have to do some edits. I don't know how that works, but that's not my job. So
Okay.
thanks again, Sue, and we really appreciate it. You take care.
Thank
Bye,
you, Elaine, and all of you. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
everyone.
You too.